where the entire concept itself breaks down and is liable to be used by anyone to prove almost anything. Mr. Lewis then admitted he can't tell us where the Scripture shows us the receipt of the keys by Peter, other than it's probably not Matthew 18:18, because there Peter receives the keys in equal level with all the other apostles. I just want to point out again, the verb in Matthew 16:19, I will give, is future tense. It refers to some future time, and unless Matthew 18:18 fulfills that, I find it extremely strange that the Bible would not record the giving of these keys if the position taken by the Roman Catholic Church is correct. Now, I would hope that in regards to Peter ending the Mosaic Law in Acts, I think it is self-evident to any person who simply examines the Scriptures, reads them for what they say, that this is a gross misinterpretation of the Scripture, and I believe it's why Mr. Lewis can't mention any of the early fathers, or really anyone who's ever come to that conclusion, because it simply doesn't come from the text itself. Mr. Lewis claims infallibility, and he can say what he wants, but to those listening to this debate and who want to weigh the two sides, I hope you'll recognize this. Throughout all of this discussion that we're having as well, I hope that it has been very, very plain that as we approach the Scriptures, or as we approach any of the historical issues, Mr. Lewis has consistently assumed what he has yet to prove. The primary overriding assumption in every argument, in every discussion of Scripture, in every discussion of a historical situation, is the existence of the Roman Catholic papacy. But that's what we're supposed to be debating here. I have insisted and have provided biblical and historical evidence that the papacy as it exists today did not exist at the time of the New Testament or in the early church. Now, Mr. Lewis cannot simply assume its existence. For example, when he talks about Ignatius writing to the Romans, he assumes something that goes against the historical evidence. The historical evidence is that there was no one-man monarchical episcopate in Rome at the time. He cannot assume that there was, just because that's what his system insists that he do, and yet this type of circular argumentation is throughout this entire section. And so, for example, when he says Cyprian may have been fallible when he said the things he did about the Pope, well, certainly, as Stephen was most definitely liable to be fallible as well. Mr. Lewis assumes the infallibility of Stephen in this case when at the very time, and this is the relevance of Cyprian, at the very time when Stephen's on earth, a martyr bishop, Cyprian, who gave his life in testimony for the gospel, he said that Stephen had made errors, he rebuked Stephen, and we're being asked, well, he could have been fallible, right? Well, yes, but so could Stephen have been fallible. Anachronistic arguments that read modern definitions back into ancient history, those types of arguments carry no weight. And I would ask that the listeners reject any argument that requires you to start off with your assumption before you come to your conclusion. That is a very, very bad direction to go. We will note that Mr. Lewis has provided us with almost no meaningful rebuttal of the materials that I presented. All he's been able to come up with is, well, maybe Cyprian was infallible. Maybe Cyprian was fallible, not infallible. Well, I mentioned Canon 6, the Council of Nicaea. I mentioned Canon 28 of the Council of Chalcedon. Were those councils infallible? Perhaps Mr. Lewis will spend some time dealing with those issues. But really, I have a difficult time at this point in really sticking to quote-unquote rebuttal for the simple reason that there is very little to rebut. There has been very little logical argumentation presented that I can interact with. The best that I could do for the next 4 minutes, and I won't, would be to present even more information, more citations, because, as I said, on any of these issues, there is a mountain of evidence that demonstrates the error of the Roman Catholic papacy. We could go into the situation with Honorius, with the situation with Liberius. We could go into Sixtus's infallible Vulgate, and there's a million things we could go into to discuss the various issues of the Roman Catholic papacy. But since this is supposed to be rebuttal, I must limit myself specifically to what Mr. Lewis has said. And I would simply close this particular section by saying that the listeners need to check for circular argumentation. They need to check for rationality of arguments, and they really need to ask themselves the question, if Mr. Lewis is presenting to us arguments no one else has ever used, might there be a reason for this that's other than some special revelation to Mr. Lewis? I think that there is a reason for it. Thank you, Mr. Parler.
Thank you, Professor White. Vin, it's your turn for 10 minutes.
Once again, Lee, how long do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me point out something which I don't think I dealt with either in the exposition or rebuttal or cross-examination, and I'm glad my opponent brought it up. As far as council decrees, only what is approved of by a pope is valid. So therefore, if a council were to pass, an ecumenical council were to pass any statements which were to impinge on the authority or status of the pope, no pope would approve it, and that would not count. So therefore, there are certain sections and certain decrees and canons of certain councils which otherwise the canons of the councils are accepted, but those canons are not. That's simply a point. Let me also deal with the concept in which I answered correctly, that I am infallible. Infallible means nothing more than the following. You're stating the truth and you can't be wrong. Therefore, when I say 2 plus 2 equals 4, I am functioning infallibly because 2 plus 2 does equal 4. What I simply said in the beginning was, and I'll say it again, that I'm sustained by God. And therefore, when I make the act of will and God uses me like the pen in the hand, yes, I do not make mistakes. But I think I made a correction, and I'll just emphasize it again. When I talked about the concept of poverty and humility in Christian communities, I am not talking about Episcopalians because, again, I would not accuse them of humility, and I'm glad Mr. White pointed that out because I want to correct it again. Maybe some of them have taken poverty vows, and maybe some of them actually obey them sincerely, but none of them are humble because they're certainly not obeying the authority left by God. They're still following their own sinful inclinations. But in the form of a rebuttal, let me point out that what my opponent has pointed out essentially comes down to a triad. Number 1, history. Number 2, his own conclusions. And number 3, his own claims. He's admitted his conclusions could be wrong. His claims literally come out of nowhere. So in a very real sense, I will dismiss them. Remember, either he said it or didn't say it or reversed himself 4 or 5 times in a very short period of time, but the best conclusion I think we can come to is Mr. White has said you can disagree with every single thing he said, still be a good Christian and go to heaven, which means what he brought up either is of no importance whatsoever, in which case it's nothing but bigotry, or it is lies, in which case it's nothing but blasphemy. The point is this. I make it as clear as possible. Disagree with my conclusions, my dogmatic statements, and you go to hell. That's true Christianity. But let me deal with the concept of history for a moment, which I think is very, very important, because he pointed out there's no references to this, no references to that, no records for this. Let's assume he's correct. Let's assume he's actually tried to find historical records. Let's assume there's no record among the early church fathers as Mr. White describes. Let's assume that. Let's not start arguing over what exists and what doesn't. What would that prove? What does the lack of documentation in an historical argument or position prove? Well, let me use an analogy. 1920, if you look